Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back over 3,000 years to experience life as an ordinary person in ancient Egypt. And trust me, you're going to wish you could step right back out again. Picture this. You're waking up on a thin reed mat in a cramped mud brick house in Memphis, the blazing sun already streaming through your single window opening, and the overwhelming smell of the Nile mixing with human waste, animal dung, and rotting fish filling your nostrils. The temperature is already climbing toward what will be another scorching day over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And you haven't even opened your eyes yet. You can hear your neighbors arguing through paper-thin walls, children crying, donkeys braying, and somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic sound of workers hauling massive stone blocks for yet another monument to your god-king pharaoh. A pharaoh who wouldn't notice if you dropped dead right now, and probably wouldn't care if he did. The reality is, despite all those gorgeous Hollywood movies and romantic documentaries about ancient Egypt's grandeur, you probably wouldn't survive your first week as a regular Egyptian citizen, let alone a full day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. Drop that in the comments and let's see how far this ancient Egyptian nightmare is reaching across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not a pharaoh, you're not a priest, you're not even a skilled craftsman. You're just another face in the crowd of Egypt's massive population, which historians estimate reached around 3 million people during the New Kingdom period. Your social status is roughly equivalent to being an invisible cog in a machine designed entirely for the benefit of people who consider you barely human. You stretch your aching muscles, feeling the familiar pain in your back from sleeping on nothing but woven reeds laid over the hard-packed earth floor, and realize that this discomfort isn't going away. It's your new permanent state of being. The first challenge of your day hasn't even begun yet, but you can already hear your stomach growling with a hunger that's become your constant companion. Your last meal was yesterday's portion of bread and beer, if you were lucky enough to get both, and your next meal is entirely dependent on whether you can work hard enough today to earn it. There's no refrigerator, no pantry, no emergency stash of snacks hidden anywhere in your tiny dwelling. Food security is a daily gamble with death itself. As you begin to sit up, you notice the familiar itching sensation across your scalp and body. Congratulations, you're hosting an entire ecosystem of lice, fleas, and other parasites that consider your unwashed skin their permanent vacation resort. Personal hygiene, as you'll quickly discover, isn't just inconvenient in ancient Egypt. It's practically impossible for someone of your social class. And the consequences of poor hygiene aren't just uncomfortable, they're frequently fatal. Your bladder is sending urgent signals, and this is where your ancient Egyptian adventure takes its first truly horrifying turn. You stumble toward what passes for bathroom facilities in your neighborhood, which is essentially a communal latrine shared by dozens of families. A simple hole in the ground surrounded by low mud brick walls that provide barely enough privacy to squat behind. The smell hits you like a physical wall long before you reach the opening. A combination of human waste, rotting organic matter, and the sweet stench of decomposition that makes your modern sensibilities recoil in absolute horror. There's no toilet paper waiting for you here, because toilet paper won't be invented for another few thousand years. Instead, you're looking at your options. Smooth stones if you're lucky, broken pottery shards if you're not, or most commonly, just sand and your bare left hand. This is why ancient Egyptians considered the left hand unclean and reserved it exclusively for bathroom duties. Eating with your left hand would be considered absolutely disgusting, though you'll quickly realize that hand washing isn't exactly a luxury you can afford very often. The communal nature of these facilities means you're sharing this space with people suffering from dysentery, intestinal parasites, and various other stomach ailments that were absolutely rampant in ancient Egypt. Historians still argue whether the high incidence of digestive diseases was primarily due to contaminated water sources or the complete lack of sanitation, but frankly, you're experiencing both problems simultaneously. Every time you use these facilities, you're essentially playing Russian roulette with cholera, typhoid, and a dozen other waterborne diseases that could kill you within days. Your stomach is already cramping, and you haven't even finished your morning routine yet. The beer you drank yesterday, which was safer than water, but still contaminated, is working its way through your system, along with whatever parasites decided to hitch a ride. Intestinal worms were so common in ancient Egypt that they were considered a normal part of life, and you can actually feel them moving around in your digestive tract. Modern people might think this is an exaggeration, but mummy examinations have revealed that virtually every ancient Egyptian, regardless of social class, was hosting multiple species of parasites. The lack of privacy is almost as disturbing as the unsanitary conditions. You're conducting your most intimate bodily functions within earshot and sometimes plain sight of your neighbors, their children, and random strangers who happen to be passing by. There's no concept of personal space or individual dignity when it comes to basic human needs. You're all just animals sharing the same watering hole, except the watering hole is contaminated with everyone's waste. As you finish your business and attempt to clean yourself with a handful of sand, you notice the flies. They're everywhere, covering every surface, including you. These aren't just annoying insects. They're disease vectors, carrying bacteria and parasites from the waste around you directly to your food, your water, your open wounds, and your eyes. Eye diseases were epidemic in ancient Egypt, partly because of these flies constantly landing on people's faces and transferring infections that would lead to blindness, scarring, and chronic pain. You stumble back toward your dwelling, already exhausted from this simple morning task, and realize that you'll have to repeat this nightmare routine at least once more today, possibly twice if your digestive system decides to rebel against whatever questionable food you manage to acquire. Your stomach is now demanding attention with increasingly violent growls, and you face the daily challenge that claimed more ancient Egyptian lives than warfare, disease, or accidents combined. Finding enough food to survive another day. You shuffle toward your meager food storage area, which consists of a few clay jars and woven baskets that offer virtually no protection against moisture, insects, or rodents. Your breakfast options are limited to what was standard for 90% of ancient Egyptians: stale bread and weak beer, assuming you managed to earn enough yesterday to afford both. The bread waiting for you is nothing like the soft, fluffy loaves you're imagining. This is a dense, coarse mixture of emmer wheat and barley that's been ground with stone corns, which means every bite contains tiny particles of sand and grit that will gradually wear down your teeth to painful nubs. Dental problems weren't just common in ancient Egypt, they were universal and agonizing. By age 30, most Egyptians had lost several teeth to infection and wear, leaving them with chronic abscesses that could literally kill them when the infection spread to their bloodstream. You break off a chunk of bread that's already developing a suspicious greenish tinge around the edges. Mold was such a constant problem that most Egyptians just scraped off what they could see and ate the rest anyway. Food poisoning was a weekly occurrence for most people, and you quickly learn to distinguish between the kind of stomach cramps that mean you're hungry versus the kind that mean you're about to spend the next few days violently emptying your digestive system from both ends. The beer accompanying your bread isn't the refreshing beverage you might hope for. Ancient Egyptian beer was thick, lumpy, and often partially fermented, creating a nutrient-rich sludge that was safer to drink than water, but still contaminated with various bacteria and yeasts that your modern digestive system would reject immediately. This beer was consumed by everyone, including children, because clean water was essentially impossible to obtain. The alcohol content was low enough that people could function while drinking it all day, but high enough to cause chronic liver problems that shortened lifespans significantly. As you choke down your breakfast, you notice something moving in the bread. Congratulations, you're sharing your meal with weevils, grain beetles, and whatever other insects managed to infiltrate your food storage. Protein was scarce in the ancient Egyptian diet, so these bugs actually represented a valuable nutritional supplement, though your modern sensibilities are probably screaming in horror right now. The nutritional content of this breakfast is woefully inadequate by modern standards. You're getting mostly empty carbohydrates with minimal protein, virtually no fresh fruits or vegetables, and none of the vitamins and minerals your body desperately needs to function properly. Historians still argue whether malnutrition or infectious disease was the primary killer in ancient Egypt, but you're experiencing both simultaneously. So the distinction seems academic when you're slowly starving while your body fights off multiple infections. Your breakfast routine is interrupted by the sound of your neighbor's children crying from hunger. Food insecurity affected entire families, and parents regularly had to choose which children would eat on any given day. Infant mortality rates exceeded 50%, and many of those deaths were simply due to starvation when families couldn't produce or purchase enough food to keep everyone alive. With your stomach barely satisfied by that nightmare breakfast, you now face the challenge of getting dressed for another day in ancient Egypt. And your clothing options would make a modern person weep with frustration. Your entire wardrobe consists of a single linen tunic that you've been wearing for weeks without washing, because soap doesn't exist yet, and clean water is too precious to waste on laundry. This tunic is made from flax fibers that have been woven into a fabric so coarse it feels like wearing a burlap sack lined with sandpaper. The linen manufacturing process in ancient Egypt produced fabric that would be considered completely unwearable by modern standards. The fibers were beaten, soaked in stagnant water for weeks, then woven on primitive looms that created an incredibly rough texture. Your tunic scratches against your skin with every movement, creating constant irritation that leads to rashes, open sores, and secondary infections. The wealthy could afford finer linen, but your social class gets the scraps, literally the leftover fibers that were too coarse for better garments. You have no underwear, because that concept won't be invented for another couple thousand years. This means your rough linen tunic is making direct contact with the most sensitive parts of your body, creating chafing and discomfort that becomes absolutely unbearable during physical labor. The lack of proper undergarments also means that maintaining any semblance of modesty is nearly impossible, especially when you're bending, lifting, or performing the manual labor that consumes most of your waking hours. Your feet are completely bare because shoes are a luxury reserved for the wealthy and the priesthood. You're about to spend your entire day walking on sand that reaches temperatures hot enough to literally cook an egg, rocky terrain that will slice your feet to ribbons, and streets covered in animal waste, human refuse, and the rotting remains of whatever died recently. The soles of your feet develop thick calluses that crack and bleed regularly, creating open wounds that serve as perfect entry points for the various infections and parasites lurking in Egypt's contaminated soil. The heat is already becoming unbearable, and you haven't even stepped outside yet. Your single layer of clothing provides no protection from the sun's rays, which means you'll be dealing with constant sunburn, heat exhaustion, and eventually skin cancer if you live long enough. Ancient Egyptians had access to some natural sun protection. They used a mixture of crocodile dung and other organic materials as sunscreen. But acquiring these materials requires resources you simply don't have. Your head covering consists of a simple cloth wrap that does almost nothing to protect your scalp from the blazing sun. Heat stroke was a common cause of death among outdoor workers, and you can already feel the heat radiating through the thin fabric. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rate among Egyptian laborers was primarily due to accidents, disease, or simple heat-related deaths. But you're likely to experience all three before your day is over. The absence of proper clothing also means you have no pockets, no way to carry tools or personal items, and no protection for your hands during manual labor. Everything you own that isn't permanently attached to your body will need to be carried, which limits your mobility and makes even simple tasks exponentially more difficult. As you adjust your scratchy tunic and prepare to face the day, you realize that your clothing is actually the least of your problems. It's just the first layer of discomfort in what promises to be an endless series of physical and psychological challenges. Your throat is already parched from the heat, and you face what might be the most dangerous challenge of your entire day: finding something safe to drink. You shuffle toward the communal water source, which is essentially a section of the Nile River that your neighborhood shares with several hundred other people, along with their livestock, their waste, and whatever dead animals happen to be floating downstream today. The water looks brown, smells worse, and contains a microscopic ecosystem of parasites, bacteria, and toxic algae that would horrify any modern person with basic knowledge of water safety. The Nile was ancient Egypt's lifeline, but it was also a massive open sewer that carried human waste, animal carcasses, industrial runoff from textile production, and the decomposing remains of everything that died upstream from your location. During flood season, this contamination was diluted somewhat, but during dry periods, you're essentially drinking liquid death. Every sip contains guinea worm larvae, schistosomiasis parasites, and various bacteria that cause dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever. You have no choice but to drink this water, because the alternative is dying of dehydration within days in Egypt's brutal climate. Some people attempt to let the water settle in clay jars so the worst sediment falls to the bottom, but this does nothing to eliminate the microscopic threats swimming around in every drop. Boiling water would help, but fuel for fires is scarce and expensive, and most people don't understand the connection between heat treatment and disease prevention anyway. The water collection process itself is fraught with danger. You're competing with dozens of other desperate people for access to the least contaminated section of the shoreline, and fights regularly break out over water rights. People have been killed over access to slightly cleaner water, and you're acutely aware that your life could end right here if you accidentally offend someone who's bigger, stronger, or more desperate than you are. As you fill your clay water jar, you notice the familiar signs of guinea worm disease in several people around you. These parasites grow up to 3 feet long inside their human hosts, then emerge through painful blisters in the skin, usually in the legs or feet. The process takes months and is agonizingly painful, often leaving victims permanently disabled. Historians still argue whether guinea worm or schistosomiasis was more prevalent in ancient Egypt, but you're likely to contract both if you live long enough. The water you're collecting has to last you for the entire day because returning to this contaminated source multiple times increases your exposure to both waterborne diseases and human violence. You're carrying this heavy jar back to your dwelling while trying not to spill any precious liquid, even though you know every drop is potentially lethal. The irony isn't lost on you that the substance keeping you alive today is probably what will kill you eventually. Your lips are already cracked and bleeding from dehydration, and you haven't even begun the physical labor that will consume most of your day. The combination of extreme heat, contaminated water, and constant physical exertion creates a perfect storm of health problems that would challenge even modern medical intervention. Ancient Egyptians had no concept of hydration science, electrolyte balance, or the relationship between water quality and disease transmission. You take your first sip of the murky liquid and immediately feel your stomach cramp in protest, but you force yourself to swallow because the alternative is certain death from dehydration. The sun has barely cleared the horizon, and already the temperature is climbing toward what will be another day of murderous heat. But you can't afford to wait for cooler weather, because cooler weather doesn't exist in ancient Egypt. You're heading out to begin your daily labor, which involves hauling massive stone blocks, digging irrigation channels, or whatever other backbreaking work the local overseers have decided you're capable of surviving today. The Egyptian workday begins before dawn and continues until the sun sets, with no breaks for heat, exhaustion, or the various medical emergencies that regularly claim workers' lives. Your job assignment depends entirely on the whims of government officials who view you as nothing more than a replaceable piece of equipment. You might spend today moving limestone blocks that weigh several hundred pounds each, using nothing but rope, wooden levers, and the combined strength of dozens of other workers who are just as malnourished and exhausted as you are. The construction projects never stop in ancient Egypt. There's always another temple, another tomb, another monument to royal ego that requires the sacrifice of common people's bodies and lives. The heat radiating from the sand is already unbearable, and you're walking barefoot across surfaces that reach temperatures hot enough to cause second-degree burns. Your feet are developing blisters within the first hour of work, and these blisters will burst and become infected wounds that make walking even more agonizing. Heat exhaustion is claiming workers around you regularly. They simply collapse and die where they fall, and their bodies are dragged away so work can continue without interruption. You're working without any protective equipment, safety procedures, or medical support if something goes wrong. Accidents are incredibly common and almost always fatal. Workers are crushed by falling stones, injured by breaking ropes, or simply collapse from heat stroke and dehydration. The overseers show no concern for worker safety because replacement workers are always available from the endless supply of desperate people who need food to survive another day. The physical demands of your labor are destroying your body at an alarming rate. Your muscles are constantly strained beyond their limits. Your joints are developing permanent damage from repetitive motions and heavy lifting, and your spine is compressed from carrying loads that would challenge modern machinery. Most Egyptian workers develop severe back problems, joint deformities, and muscle injuries that left them permanently disabled before age 40. Your coworkers are dying around you from various combinations of heat stroke, dehydration, accidents, and exhaustion. The mortality rate among construction workers was so high that entire crews were replaced multiple times during major projects. Historians still argue whether more Egyptians died from warfare, disease, or simple workplace accidents. But you're witnessing the workplace accidents firsthand, and they're absolutely horrific. The overseers carry whips and use them liberally on anyone who shows signs of slowing down, taking breaks, or collapsing from exhaustion. These aren't gentle encouragements. They're brutal beatings that leave permanent scars and often cause infections that prove fatal. You're being literally whipped like an animal while performing labor that's killing you slowly, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it because resistance means immediate execution. Your water ration is already running low, and you're only halfway through the morning work period. Dehydration is setting in rapidly, causing dizziness, confusion, and muscle cramps that make the physical labor even more dangerous and difficult. Your inevitable workplace injury arrives right on schedule when a rope snaps and sends a sharp piece of limestone flying directly into your forearm, opening a gash that immediately begins bleeding profusely. In modern times, this would mean a trip to the emergency room for stitches and antibiotics, but in ancient Egypt, this means you're about to experience medical treatment that might be more dangerous than the original injury. The local healer approaches with a collection of tools and remedies that would terrify any modern person who understands basic medical science. Ancient Egyptian medicine was a bizarre combination of surprisingly sophisticated anatomical knowledge and absolutely terrifying superstitious practices. Your healer begins by examining the wound, while muttering incantations to drive away evil spirits, because Egyptians believed that many injuries were caused by supernatural forces rather than simple accidents. He's simultaneously trying to treat your physical wound and perform an exorcism, which means you're getting medical advice mixed with religious ritual in ways that often made injuries worse rather than better. The first step in treating your cut involves washing it with water from the same contaminated Nile source you've been drinking from, which immediately introduces bacteria, parasites, and various other microscopic threats directly into your bloodstream. Your healer genuinely believes he's helping by cleaning the wound, but he's actually guaranteeing that you'll develop a serious infection within days. The concept of sterile medical procedures won't be discovered for thousands of years, so every medical intervention carries the risk of introducing new diseases. Next comes the application of various poultices and ointments made from ingredients that range from genuinely helpful to absolutely horrifying. Your wound is being treated with a mixture that includes honey, which actually does have antibacterial properties, combined with ground-up beetles, crocodile dung, and rotting meat. The honey might help prevent infection, but the other ingredients are introducing new bacteria and toxins that will cause inflammation, fever, and possibly blood poisoning. The bandaging process involves wrapping your wound with linen strips that haven't been cleaned or sterilized in any way. These bandages have been used on previous patients with various diseases, then reused without any attempt to remove contamination. You're essentially sharing blood-borne pathogens with everyone who's been treated by this healer recently, which means your simple cut could expose you to everything from hepatitis to various forms of parasitic infections. Egyptian medical practitioners had impressive knowledge of anatomy from their mummification practices, but they had no understanding of infection, disease transmission, or proper wound care. Historians still argue whether Egyptian medicine saved more lives than it killed, but based on your current experience, you're betting on the latter. Your healer is genuinely trying to help, but his methods are more likely to kill you than cure you. The pain relief options available to you consist of various plant-based substances that range from mildly effective to completely hallucinogenic. You might receive some willow bark, which contains natural salicylic acid and actually works as a painkiller. or you might get a mixture of opium and beer that will make you forget about the pain while potentially stopping your heart. Ancient Egyptian pain management was essentially a game of chemical Russian roulette. Your wound is now bandaged, treated, and blessed by the gods, but you're expected to return to work immediately because taking time off for medical recovery isn't an option when you're living hand to mouth. The throbbing pain in your bandaged arm is nothing compared to the terror you feel when you realize you've missed your morning prayers to the local gods, which means you're now potentially facing divine retribution that could destroy not just your life, but your entire family's prospects for survival. Ancient Egyptian religion wasn't a comforting weekly ritual. It was a complex, demanding system of obligations that controlled every aspect of daily life. And failure to meet these obligations could result in anything from crop failure to sudden death to eternal damnation in the afterlife. You stumble toward the local shrine, where you're expected to make offerings you can't afford to gods who might not even notice your existence. The Egyptian pantheon included hundreds of deities, each with specific requirements, preferences, and temperaments that could turn deadly if you accidentally offended them. You need to appease Ra, the sun god, Sobek, the crocodile god, Taweret, the hippo goddess, and dozens of other divine beings who control everything from the weather to your digestive health to whether your children survive infancy. Your daily religious obligations include reciting prayers you've memorized phonetically without understanding their meaning, making food offerings from your already inadequate supplies, and performing ritual purifications that require precious water and time you don't have. The priests who oversee these activities are well-fed, well-dressed, and completely unsympathetic to your struggles. They demand perfect compliance regardless of your circumstances, and they have the authority to declare you cursed if you fail to meet their standards. The offerings required for proper worship include bread, beer, meat, and various luxury items that represent a significant portion of your daily income. You're literally choosing between feeding your family and avoiding divine punishment, and there's no right answer to this impossible dilemma. Skip the offerings and risk supernatural retribution. Make the offerings and risk starvation. Either choice could kill you, just through different mechanisms. Egyptian religious practice also required you to maintain ritual purity, which meant avoiding contact with certain animals, foods, and people at specific times of the month. This is practically impossible when you're living in close quarters with livestock, working alongside people of different ritual statuses, and eating whatever food you can acquire. The purity requirements were designed for wealthy people with servants and leisure time, not for working-class Egyptians who are struggling to survive. The consequences of religious failure weren't just spiritual. They were immediate and practical. Priests controlled access to certain jobs, marriage arrangements, and community resources. Being declared religiously unclean could mean economic exile, social ostracism, and the loss of whatever minimal safety net your community provided. Your religious standing directly affected your ability to earn money, find housing, and protect your family from various threats. Historians still argue whether Egyptian religion was primarily a system of social control or genuine spiritual belief. But from your perspective, the distinction doesn't matter when you're facing real consequences for religious failures. You're spending precious time and resources on elaborate rituals while your basic survival needs go unmet. And the gods you're desperately trying to appease seem completely indifferent to your suffering. The most terrifying aspect of Egyptian religion is the concept of divine judgment in the afterlife, where your heart will be weighed against a feather to determine your eternal fate. The wealthy can afford elaborate mummification and tomb preparations, but poor people face the prospect of spiritual annihilation after death. Your religious obligations have consumed what little time and resources you had available, but your stomach is demanding attention again, which means you need to venture into the chaotic nightmare that passes for a marketplace in ancient Egypt. The market is a sprawling collection of temporary stalls, street vendors, and opportunistic sellers who view every transaction as a chance to separate you from whatever meager possessions you've managed to accumulate. The air is thick with dust, smoke from cooking fires, and the overwhelming stench of rotting food, unwashed bodies, and animal waste. Your shopping experience begins with the horrifying realization that you have no idea what anything actually costs, because standardized pricing doesn't exist yet. Every purchase requires aggressive negotiation with sellers who are trying to determine exactly how desperate you are and charge accordingly. The vendors can smell your hunger from across the marketplace, and they know you'll eventually pay whatever they demand because the alternative is starvation. This isn't friendly haggling. It's economic warfare where the stakes are literally life and death. The food available for purchase ranges from questionable to absolutely terrifying. Meat sits in the blazing sun covered with flies, developing bacterial colonies that would horrify modern food safety inspectors. Vegetables are wilted, rotting, and often contaminated with human waste that was used as fertilizer. The bread for sale is frequently moldy, weevil-infested, or made with grain that's been diluted with sand and other fillers to increase profits. Every food purchase is a gamble with food poisoning, and you're going to lose that gamble regularly. The vendors themselves are often as desperate as their customers, which creates a marketplace atmosphere of mutual desperation and barely contained violence. People fight over access to the least contaminated food. Arguments over prices escalate into physical confrontations, and theft is so common that you have to guard your possessions constantly while trying to complete transactions. You're simultaneously trying to buy food, avoid being robbed, prevent being cheated, and stay alive in an environment where any of these failures could prove fatal. Quality control is non-existent, so you're frequently purchasing items that are completely different from what was advertised. That fresh fish might be several days old and crawling with maggots. The pure olive oil could be diluted with cheaper substances or contaminated with various toxic additives. The grain you're buying might be mostly sand, chaff, or even ground-up pottery designed to add weight and bulk to increase profits. The payment system is equally nightmarish, involving complex barter arrangements where you're trading portions of your labor, small personal items, or promises of future service for immediate food needs. You have no currency in the modern sense, which means every transaction requires negotiating exchange rates between completely different types of goods and services. Your bandaged arm hurts terribly, but you might need to trade manual labor for tonight's dinner. Counterfeit goods are everywhere, and you have no way to verify authenticity until after you've completed the transaction and discovered that your purchase is worthless. Historians still argue whether marketplace fraud or simple food contamination killed more ancient Egyptians, but you're facing both problems simultaneously every time you try to buy necessities. The marketplace closes at sunset, regardless of whether you've managed to acquire enough food to survive another day. And tomorrow you'll have to repeat this entire nightmare process again. ... After your harrowing marketplace experience, you return to what loosely qualifies as your home, a cramped mud brick structure that you share with your extended family, their livestock, and an alarming variety of uninvited guests that range from merely annoying to genuinely life-threatening. Your dwelling consists of 2 small rooms with walls so thin you can hear every conversation, argument, and bodily function of your neighbors. while they can hear yours with equal clarity. Privacy is a luxury that doesn't exist for people of your social class, and personal space is measured in inches rather than feet. The construction of your home would violate every modern building code ever written. The mud brick walls are already developing cracks that let in sand, insects, and small animals, while the roof is a collection of palm fronds and dried mud that leaks constantly and threatens to collapse during the next windstorm. The floor is simply packed earth that turns to mud when water enters, creating perfect breeding conditions for various bacteria, parasites, and disease-carrying insects that consider your home their permanent residence. Your roommates include not just your human family members, but also the goats, chickens, and other livestock that provide occasional food and income when they're not dying from disease or being eaten by predators. These animals live inside your dwelling because leaving them outside means they'll be stolen immediately, but keeping them inside means you're sharing your living space with their waste, their parasites, and their various infectious diseases. The smell is overwhelming and constant, a mixture of animal urine, rotting food scraps, and human waste that would make most modern people vomit within minutes. The pest control situation in your home is absolutely hopeless. Rats scurry across the floor constantly, carrying fleas that spread bubonic plague and other diseases that could wipe out your entire family within days. Scorpions hide in dark corners and under sleeping mats, delivering potentially fatal stings to anyone unlucky enough to encounter them during the night. Snakes slither through cracks in the walls, some of them venomous species that could kill you within hours if they decide you're a threat to their territory. Your sleeping arrangements consist of thin reed mats laid directly on the dirt floor, offering no protection from the cold night air, the various creatures crawling around your dwelling, or the dampness that seeps up from the ground and causes constant respiratory problems. You're sharing these inadequate sleeping surfaces with multiple family members, which means you're in constant physical contact with other people's unwashed bodies, open wounds, and whatever diseases they might be carrying. Storage space is virtually non-existent, so your few possessions are scattered around the rooms where they're constantly at risk of being damaged by moisture, eaten by insects, or contaminated by animal waste. Your clothing, food, tools, and personal items are all mixed together in a chaotic arrangement that makes finding anything a frustrating ordeal, especially when you're exhausted from a day of brutal physical labor. The lighting in your home comes from small oil lamps that produce more smoke than illumination, creating air quality problems that cause chronic coughing, eye irritation, and respiratory infections. Historians still argue whether poor indoor air quality or overcrowding was the primary health hazard in Egyptian homes, but you're experiencing both problems simultaneously, and they're definitely making each other worse. Your wounded arm is throbbing painfully, and you need to rest, but rest is nearly impossible in an environment where someone is always coughing, crying, arguing, or making some other noise that prevents sleep. The sun is setting, which means it's time for another meal that will test your digestive system's ability to process foods that would be condemned by any modern health department. Your dinner options depend entirely on what you manage to acquire during today's marketplace nightmare, and the cooking facilities available to you consist of a small fire pit that you share with several other families, along with a few clay pots that haven't been properly cleaned since they were made. The food preparation process is going to introduce new bacteria and contaminants to whatever you're eating, making an already dangerous meal even more likely to cause serious illness. Tonight's menu features a piece of fish that's been sitting in the heat all day, developing a smell that suggests advanced decomposition and a texture that feels slimy to the touch. This fish was caught from the same section of the Nile that serves as your neighborhood's drinking water, sewage system, and animal watering hole, which means it's been marinating in human waste, industrial runoff, and whatever dead animals happen to float by during its lifetime. You're about to consume concentrated Nile pollution in fish form, and your stomach is already cramping in anticipation. The vegetables accompanying your fish consist of onions and garlic that are sprouting, wilted greens that are turning brown around the edges, and some unidentifiable root vegetables that might be edible or might be toxic. There's no way to tell without eating them and waiting to see what happens. Fresh vegetables were incredibly expensive and rarely available to people of your social class. So you're usually eating produce that's past its expiration date by modern standards and contaminated with various forms of bacteria that cause food poisoning. Your cooking fuel consists of dried animal dung mixed with straw, which creates a fire that produces more smoke than heat and fills your food with particulates that cause respiratory problems and digestive issues. The smoke is so thick that you can barely see what you're cooking, and the taste it imparts to your food is bitter, acrid, and completely unappetizing. But fuel is expensive and scarce, so you can't afford to be picky about what you burn or how it affects the flavor of your meals. The cooking process itself is fraught with dangers that go beyond simple food contamination. Your clay pots are cracked and porous, allowing bacteria to accumulate in places where you can't clean them properly. The cooking utensils you're using have been shared by multiple families and haven't been sanitized in any meaningful way. So you're transferring diseases and parasites directly from other people's meals into your own food. Seasoning options are limited to salt that's been contaminated with sand and various other mineral deposits, along with herbs that might be medicinal or might be poisonous, depending on how they were harvested and stored. Ancient Egyptians had access to some exotic spices through trade, but people of your social class get the scraps and leftovers that weren't good enough for wealthy customers. The meal preparation is taking place in near darkness because oil for lamps is expensive, and you're essentially cooking by feel and smell rather than sight. This means you have no way to tell if your food is properly cooked, contaminated with foreign objects, or developing dangerous bacterial growth that could kill you within hours of consumption. Historians still argue whether malnutrition or food poisoning was the primary dietary killer in ancient Egypt. But you're facing both problems with every meal, so the academic distinction seems irrelevant when you're slowly poisoning yourself with every bite. As darkness falls across your neighborhood, you discover that nighttime in ancient Egypt brings an entirely new set of horrors that make your daytime struggles seem almost manageable by comparison. The streets become hunting grounds for desperate people who view robbery, assault, and murder as viable career options when legitimate work doesn't provide enough income to survive. You can hear footsteps outside your thin walls, voices discussing potential targets, and the occasional scream that suggests someone's evening has taken a very bad turn. Crime in ancient Egypt wasn't just opportunistic theft. It was organized, systematic, and incredibly violent. Tomb robbing was practically a professional industry, with entire gangs specializing in breaking into burial sites to steal valuable grave goods that could be sold in underground markets. These criminals were often former construction workers who knew exactly how tombs were built and where the most valuable items were hidden, and they had no qualms about killing anyone who interfered with their operations. Your neighborhood watch consists of neighbors taking turns staying awake to listen for trouble. But this system is completely inadequate when the criminals are organized, well-armed, and desperate enough to kill for a handful of grain or a small piece of jewelry. The people standing guard are just as malnourished and exhausted as you are, and they're trying to protect their families with improvised weapons against professional criminals who make their living through violence. A legal system offers no protection for people of your social class because law enforcement is primarily concerned with protecting wealthy citizens and government property. If you're robbed, assaulted, or even murdered, there's virtually no chance that the perpetrators will be caught or punished unless they also happen to commit crimes against important people. Justice in ancient Egypt was based on social status, not moral principles, and your status puts you firmly in the category of expendable victims. Street lighting doesn't exist, so criminals can operate under cover of complete darkness while their victims stumble around blind and helpless. The narrow alleyways between buildings create perfect ambush sites where multiple attackers can corner single victims with no possibility of escape or rescue. Even if you manage to fight off your attackers, the noise will attract more criminals who view disturbances as opportunities to join in the violence. The most terrifying aspect of nighttime crime is that it's often committed by people you know. Neighbors who are facing the same desperate circumstances and have decided that robbing their friends is preferable to watching their own families starve. Trust becomes impossible when anyone could be a potential threat, and social bonds disintegrate under the pressure of survival competition. Violence isn't limited to stranger-on-stranger crime. Domestic disputes regularly escalate to fatal levels because people are living under constant stress, sharing impossibly cramped spaces, and competing for inadequate resources. Family members kill each other over food, water, sleeping space, and perceived slights that would be minor annoyances under normal circumstances, but become life-or-death issues when everyone is operating at the edge of survival. Historians still argue whether crime rates in ancient Egypt were higher in urban or rural areas. But from your perspective in this overcrowded neighborhood, the violence is constant and inescapable. You're trying to sleep while listening for sounds that might indicate imminent danger, knowing that your thin walls and flimsy door provide no real protection against determined criminals. Your wounded arm is making sleep even more difficult, and the pain medication you received earlier is wearing off, leaving you alert to every sound outside. The cramped confines of your dwelling become even more oppressive as night falls and your extended family members gather for what passes as evening relaxation time, which mainly consists of arguing over resources, space, and the countless decisions that affect everyone's survival prospects. Your family structure follows ancient Egyptian traditions that prioritize group survival over individual comfort, which means your personal needs and preferences are completely irrelevant when they conflict with family obligations or economic necessities. Your marriage, if you're fortunate enough to have one, was arranged by your parents based entirely on economic considerations rather than personal compatibility or romantic attraction. Your spouse is essentially a business partner in the enterprise of staying alive, and the relationship dynamics are shaped by the constant stress of poverty, hunger, and the need to produce children who might survive to adulthood and provide labor or income for the family unit. Romance is a luxury that doesn't exist when you're focused on basic survival needs. The children in your household are simultaneously precious resources and enormous burdens that consume food, space, and attention while providing minimal assistance with the work required to keep everyone alive. Child mortality rates exceed 50%, which means you're constantly dealing with the death of infants and young children, while also trying to protect the survivors from diseases, accidents, and malnutrition that threaten them daily. Parenting in ancient Egypt consists mainly of trying to keep your children alive long enough to become useful workers. Privacy for intimate activities doesn't exist when you're sharing two small rooms with multiple family members, livestock, and whatever neighbors might be visiting or seeking shelter. Sexual relationships must be conducted within earshot of children, elderly relatives, and animals, creating psychological stress and social complications that would be unthinkable in modern contexts. The lack of birth control means that sexual activity frequently results in pregnancies that the family cannot afford to support, leading to difficult decisions about which children to keep and which ones to abandon. Personal hygiene becomes a family-wide challenge when water is scarce. Soap doesn't exist, and washing facilities are shared by dozens of people. Everyone in your household smells terrible, has various skin conditions, and is hosting multiple species of parasites that spread freely among family members through close contact and shared sleeping arrangements. Lice, fleas, and other insects treat your family as a single ecosystem, moving freely from person to person and creating constant itching, irritation, and disease transmission. The elderly members of your family are simultaneously sources of wisdom and additional mouths to feed when they're no longer capable of productive work. Ancient Egyptian society had some respect for elders, but practical considerations often took precedence over cultural ideals when resources were limited. Caring for aging parents or grandparents could mean the difference between survival and starvation for younger family members, creating painful moral dilemmas that had no good solutions. Conflicts over inheritance, property rights, and family responsibilities are constant sources of tension that can explode into violence when people are operating under extreme stress. Brothers fight over their father's tools, wives argue with their mothers-in-law over food distribution, and children compete for parental attention and resources in ways that would be heartbreaking under normal circumstances, but become matters of life and death in your situation. Historians still argue whether family structures in ancient Egypt were primarily supportive or exploitative, but from your perspective, they're both simultaneously. Your family provides the only safety net available, while also creating additional obligations and complications that make survival even more challenging. Your precarious existence becomes even more terrifying when you consider how completely dependent you are on the Nile's annual flood cycle, which determines whether your family eats regularly or slowly starves to death over the coming year. The river's behavior controls every aspect of Egyptian life, from agricultural production to transportation to the availability of construction work. And this year's flood could be the difference between relative prosperity and complete disaster for millions of people. The flood season begins with anxious waiting as everyone watches the river's water levels and tries to predict whether this year will bring the perfect amount of flooding, too little water that causes drought and famine, or too much water that destroys homes and drowns crops before they can be harvested. There's no way to control or predict the Nile's behavior, which means your survival is entirely dependent on natural forces that operate according to their own mysterious patterns. When the floods arrive, your neighborhood becomes a partially submerged disaster zone where sewage, garbage, and dead animals float through the streets while residents scramble to protect their possessions and find dry places to sleep. The floodwater mixes human waste with agricultural runoff, creating a toxic soup that breeds disease while simultaneously depositing the fertile silt that makes Egyptian agriculture possible. You're living in the middle of a natural disaster that's also an economic necessity. The flooding displaces families from their homes, destroys food storage facilities, and creates perfect breeding conditions for mosquitoes that carry malaria and other vector-borne diseases. Your already inadequate housing becomes completely uninhabitable during flood season, forcing you to seek temporary shelter wherever you can find it, while competing with thousands of other displaced people for limited space and resources. Agricultural work during flood season consists of desperately trying to plant crops in the brief window when the water recedes, but the soil is still moist enough to support plant growth. You're working in fields that are contaminated with sewage and dead animals, using tools that are inadequate for the tasks required, and racing against time to complete planting before the soil dries out completely and becomes useless for agriculture. The uncertainty of flood timing means that you can't plan effectively for the coming year. A late flood might destroy crops that were planted too early, while an early flood might arrive before you finished preparing the fields. Either scenario could mean hunger, economic hardship, and the need to compete with desperate neighbors for whatever food remains available in local markets. Crop failures during bad flood years create cascading disasters that affect every aspect of society. Food prices skyrocket, unemployment increases as construction projects are canceled, and social unrest becomes common as hungry people resort to theft, violence, and rebellion to obtain the resources they need for survival. Historians still argue whether bad flood years or foreign invasions caused more political instability in ancient Egypt. But you're experiencing the flood-related chaos firsthand, and it's absolutely devastating. The psychological stress of depending entirely on unpredictable natural forces creates a constant state of anxiety that affects your mental health, your relationships, and your ability to make rational decisions about the future. You're trying to plan for tomorrow while knowing that circumstances completely beyond your control could destroy everything you've worked to build. Your wounded arm is still painful, and the infection from your medical treatment is beginning to cause fever and swelling that suggest serious complications ahead. Your fever is spiking from the infected wound when the sound you've been dreading finally arrives. The heavy footsteps and authoritative voices of government tax collectors making their rounds through your neighborhood. These aren't polite accountants asking for voluntary contributions. They're armed enforcers backed by the full power of the Pharaoh's government, and they have the legal authority to seize your property, enslave your family members, or simply execute you if you can't meet their demands for tribute for the God King's treasury. The Egyptian tax system is designed to extract maximum resources from the population, while providing minimal services in return. Your tax obligations include portions of any crops you might grow, percentages of any income you earn from labor, contributions of goods or materials for government projects, and mandatory service periods where you're essentially enslaved for royal construction projects. The tax collectors don't care about your personal circumstances, your infected wound, or your family's survival needs. They only care about meeting their quotas. The assessment process is deliberately arbitrary and corrupt, allowing tax collectors to demand whatever they think you might be able to pay, plus additional bribes for the privilege of not being beaten or imprisoned during the collection process. There's no appeals process, no standardized rates, and no consideration for your ability to survive after paying what they demand. The collectors are motivated by personal profit because they keep portions of whatever they collect beyond their official quotas. Your possessions are being inventoried by men who view everything you own as potential government property. That clay water jar you risked your life to fill, it could be confiscated as part of your ceramic goods tax. The scratchy linen tunic that's your only clothing, it might be seized as textile tribute. Even your meager food supplies are subject to confiscation because the government's needs take precedence over your family's nutrition requirements. The most terrifying aspect of the tax system is the debt slavery provision, which allows collectors to claim you or your family members as property if you can't meet your financial obligations. Your children could be taken as government slaves, your spouse could be assigned to work in royal workshops, and you could be sentenced to labor gangs that work until death on construction projects. Debt slavery was hereditary, meaning your descendants would inherit your tax obligations along with your bondage status. Physical punishment for tax resistance ranges from beatings to mutilation to execution, depending on the collector's moods and the amount of money involved. People are regularly killed during tax collection disputes, and their deaths serve as warnings to other potential resistors. The collectors carry weapons and use them liberally on anyone who questions their authority or challenges their demands for payment. Your infected wound is making it difficult to think clearly, but you need to negotiate with these collectors while you're running a fever and dealing with pain that's becoming increasingly severe. The infection is spreading up your arm, causing red streaks that indicate blood poisoning, and you might be dying while trying to prevent your family from being enslaved for unpaid taxes. Historians still argue whether taxation or warfare was the primary cause of population decline in ancient Egypt. But from your perspective, the tax collectors are essentially conducting warfare against civilians, using legal authority instead of military force to achieve the same results of resource extraction and population control. The collectors are demanding immediate payment, and you have nothing left to give them except your life, your family's freedom, or promises of future labor that you might not survive long enough to fulfill. Your desperate attempts to negotiate with the tax collectors are interrupted by an even more horrifying development: the arrival of military recruitment officers who are conducting a forced conscription sweep through your neighborhood. These men aren't looking for volunteers. They're collecting warm bodies to feed into Egypt's military machine, and your infected wound, malnutrition, and obvious unfitness for combat are completely irrelevant to their quotas. The Egyptian army needs soldiers for border conflicts, construction projects, and various imperial adventures, and they're taking anyone who's alive and capable of following basic orders. Military service in ancient Egypt is essentially a death sentence disguised as patriotic duty. Soldiers receive minimal training, inadequate equipment, and are expected to march hundreds of miles across desert terrain while carrying heavy packs and weapons. The mortality rate among conscripts exceeds 50%, and most deaths aren't from glorious battlefield combat. They're from disease, exhaustion, starvation, and simple accidents that occur when poorly trained people are given dangerous weapons and sent into hostile environments. Your military equipment consists of a bronze-tipped spear that's been used by dozens of previous soldiers, a wooden shield that's cracked and provides minimal protection, and a cloth uniform that offers no defense against weapons, weather, or the various environmental hazards you'll encounter during military campaigns. Body armor is reserved for officers and elite units, which means you're essentially walking into battle wearing street clothes and hoping that your enemies are equally poorly equipped. The training process involves learning to march in formation, follow shouted commands, and use your weapons without accidentally killing your fellow soldiers. Military discipline is enforced through brutal physical punishment that includes beatings, mutilation, and execution for various infractions, ranging from cowardice to insubordination to simple failure to understand orders. The officers view enlisted men as expendable resources rather than human beings with inherent value. Combat in ancient Egypt is up close, personal, and absolutely terrifying. You're fighting with bronze weapons against enemies who are trying to kill you with swords, spears, arrows, and various other implements designed to cause maximum damage to human bodies. There's no medical support, no evacuation procedures, and no treatment for combat injuries beyond basic battlefield first aid that's often more harmful than helpful. The logistics of military campaigns are nightmarish for common soldiers. You're expected to carry your own food, water, and equipment while marching across terrain that ranges from burning desert to swampy river deltas. Supply lines are unreliable, foraging opportunities are limited, and you're often hungry, thirsty, and exhausted before you even reach the battlefield, where people will be trying to kill you. Your infected wound is now causing delirium and weakness that make you completely unsuitable for military service. But the recruitment officers don't care about your medical condition. They're filling quotas, not building an effective fighting force. And your survival prospects are irrelevant to their administrative requirements. Historians still argue whether ancient armies were primarily composed of volunteers or conscripts, but you're experiencing forced recruitment firsthand, and it's clearly involuntary servitude. The military campaign you're being assigned to involves marching into Nubia to suppress rebellions against Egyptian rule, which means weeks of desert travel, followed by combat against people who know the terrain better than you do, and have every motivation to fight desperately for their freedom and independence. Your fever is spiking higher, and you're beginning to hallucinate from the infection that's spreading through your bloodstream. Your deteriorating medical condition attracts the attention of local legal authorities who are investigating whether your illness is genuine or if you're attempting to avoid military service through deliberate self-harm, which is a capital offense under Egyptian law. The legal system you're about to encounter is designed primarily to maintain social order and protect government interests, not to ensure justice or protect individual rights. Your infection and fever are being treated as potential evidence of criminal behavior, rather than medical emergencies requiring treatment. The investigation process involves interrogation by officials who have no medical training, but unlimited authority to determine your guilt or innocence based on their personal opinions and whatever bribes they might receive from interested parties. Egyptian justice relies heavily on confession, which means you'll be tortured until you admit to whatever crimes the investigators think you might have committed. The torture methods include beatings, burning, and various forms of mutilation that often prove fatal regardless of whether you're actually guilty of anything. Your legal status as a commoner means you have virtually no rights under Egyptian law. Wealthy citizens can hire advocates, present evidence, and appeal unfavorable decisions. But people of your social class are essentially property of the state that can be disposed of according to administrative convenience. The legal proceedings against you will be brief, one-sided, and focused primarily on maintaining social hierarchy rather than determining factual truth about your circumstances. The evidence against you consists entirely of circumstantial observations. You're sick when military recruiters arrived. You attempted to negotiate with tax collectors, and you've been observed associating with other people who might be politically unreliable. In Egyptian courts, suspicious behavior is often treated as equivalent to proven guilt, especially when the defendants lack social status or political connections that might complicate prosecution efforts. Penalties for the crimes you're suspected of range from additional tax obligations to enslavement to various forms of corporal punishment that include amputation, branding, and execution. The punishment phase of Egyptian justice is designed to serve as public entertainment and social control rather than rehabilitation or proportional response to criminal behavior. Your sentence will be carried out immediately and publicly to ensure that other potential lawbreakers understand the consequences of challenging government authority. The legal process is complicated by the fact that you're running a high fever and barely conscious from the spreading infection in your wounded arm. Your ability to understand charges, respond to questions, or defend yourself is severely compromised by your medical condition, but Egyptian courts have no provisions for mentally incapacitated defendants. You're expected to participate in proceedings that could determine your fate while you're delirious and possibly dying from blood poisoning. Your family members are also being investigated as potential accomplices in whatever crimes you might have committed. Collective punishment is common in Egyptian law, and entire families can be enslaved, executed, or exiled based on the actions of individual members. Your infected wound isn't just threatening your life, it's potentially destroying your family's survival prospects by exposing them to legal consequences they can't control or avoid. Historians still argue whether Egyptian legal system was primarily punitive or rehabilitative, but from your perspective as a defendant, it's clearly designed to eliminate potential troublemakers rather than address underlying causes of criminal behavior. Your trial is essentially an administrative formality before your execution, enslavement, or exile to remote desert regions where survival is unlikely. The courtroom is filled with spectators who view legal proceedings as entertainment, and your suffering is providing amusement for people who are grateful that someone else is facing these consequences instead of them, as the legal proceedings blur into a nightmarish haze of fever-induced confusion. Your thoughts turn involuntarily to what will happen to your body after death, and the realization fills you with a terror that goes beyond simple fear of dying. The elaborate mummification processes and eternal afterlife preparations that define Egyptian culture in popular imagination are exclusively reserved for pharaohs, nobles, and wealthy merchants who can afford the astronomical costs of proper burial rituals. For someone of your social class, death means a very different and far more horrifying fate. Your body will receive no preservation treatment whatsoever, because the mummification process requires expensive materials, skilled technicians, and weeks of labor that cost more than most Egyptians earn in their entire lifetimes. The cheapest mummification option available costs roughly 10 years' worth of income for a common laborer, which makes it completely impossible for your family to afford, even if they wanted to honor your memory with proper burial rituals. Instead of being carefully preserved for the afterlife, your corpse will be wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth your family can spare, then buried in a shallow grave in the desert outside the city limits, where wild animals will likely dig up and scatter your remains within days of interment. The hot, dry sand will naturally preserve some parts of your body, but this accidental mummification bears no resemblance to the elaborate processes that ensure eternal life for wealthy Egyptians. Your burial goods will consist of whatever broken pottery, worn-out tools, or personal items your family can afford to part with, rather than the golden treasures, elaborate furniture, and magical amulets that accompany rich people into the afterlife. These meager possessions are supposed to help you navigate the complex spiritual journey that awaits dead souls, but they're completely inadequate for the challenges described in Egyptian religious texts. The afterlife itself presents unique horrors for poor people who lack proper burial preparations. According to Egyptian religious beliefs, your soul must pass through various trials and judgments in the underworld. But these spiritual obstacles are designed for people who have access to magical spells, protective amulets, and detailed maps of the afterlife realm. Without these expensive resources, your soul will be lost, confused, and vulnerable to spiritual predators that consume unprepared spirits. The weighing of your heart against the feather of truth is supposed to determine your eternal fate. But this judgment process assumes that you've lived according to religious principles that were specifically designed for wealthy people with leisure time for elaborate spiritual practices. Your heart will be heavy with the sins of survival, stealing food when your family was starving, lying to authorities to avoid persecution, and various other moral compromises that were necessary to stay alive in your circumstances. The most terrifying aspect of death for poor Egyptians is the possibility of complete spiritual annihilation, where your soul simply ceases to exist rather than continuing into an eternal afterlife. This fate is reserved for people who fail the various tests and trials of the underworld, and your lack of proper preparation makes failure almost inevitable. Historians still argue whether ancient Egyptians actually believed these spiritual concepts, or whether they were primarily social control mechanisms. But the terror you're feeling about eternal oblivion is very real. Your infected wound is now causing hallucinations where you can see religious scenes from tomb paintings, but instead of depicting your successful journey to eternal life, they show your soul being devoured by monsters while your unprepared spirit wanders lost in spiritual darkness forever. As your fever reaches its peak and delirium sets in, you become acutely aware of the absolute powerlessness that defines every aspect of life under ancient Egypt's divine monarchy, where the pharaoh isn't just your political ruler, but literally a living god whose whims determine whether you live or die on any given day. Your infection, your legal troubles, your military conscription, and your family's survival prospects are all subject to the arbitrary decisions of a single individual who considers himself the earthly incarnation of divine will and treats his subjects accordingly. The pharaoh's absolute authority extends beyond simple political control into every detail of daily life. From the clothes you're allowed to wear, to the jobs you can perform, to the gods you're permitted to worship, your existence is entirely dependent on maintaining his favor, or at least avoiding his attention. Because drawing royal notice as a commoner usually means suffering consequences that range from enslavement to execution, depending on the divine monarch's mood and the advice of his courtiers. Royal decisions that affect millions of people are made based on personal preferences, religious visions, and political considerations that have nothing to do with the welfare of ordinary Egyptians. The pharaoh might decide to launch expensive military campaigns that require massive conscription, build elaborate monuments that consume decades of labor and resources, or implement new tax policies that push entire regions into starvation. These choices are presented as divine commands that cannot be questioned or opposed without committing blasphemy against the gods themselves. Your individual suffering is completely invisible to the royal court, where advisors compete to provide the pharaoh with optimistic reports about the kingdom's prosperity, while carefully avoiding any mention of the poverty, disease, and desperation that characterize life for common people. The pharaoh genuinely believes that his kingdom is thriving because he's never exposed to accurate information about conditions outside the palace walls. The divine nature of pharaonic authority means that resistance to royal commands isn't just political rebellion, it's spiritual warfare against the cosmic order that maintains universal harmony. Questioning the pharaoh's decisions means questioning the god's will, which makes you an enemy of divine justice and natural law. This religious dimension of political authority makes effective opposition nearly impossible, because potential rebels must overcome not just practical obstacles, but also their own spiritual terror of offending supernatural powers. Your death will mean absolutely nothing to the pharaoh, who considers common people to be roughly equivalent to livestock in terms of their importance to the kingdom's welfare. Individual lives are completely expendable when they conflict with royal priorities, and mass casualties among workers, soldiers, and ordinary citizens are treated as acceptable costs of maintaining divine rule and imperial grandeur. The pharaoh's immortality projects require constant human sacrifice in the form of workers who die building tombs, soldiers who die defending borders, and taxpayers who die from the economic burden of supporting royal lifestyle. Your infected wound is just one tiny casualty in a system designed to transfer resources from millions of expendable people to a single divine individual who will be remembered forever while your name disappears completely from history. Historians still argue whether pharaonic authority was primarily based on religious belief or military force. But from your perspective as a dying subject, the distinction doesn't matter when you're facing the same consequences regardless of the theoretical foundation of royal power. The pharaoh's shadow touches every aspect of your existence, and even your death serves his purposes by removing one more burden from the kingdom's resources. Your hallucinations now include visions of the pharaoh's court, where well-fed nobles discuss your neighborhood's problems as abstract policy questions, while your actual suffering remains completely invisible to their privileged perspective.